The outstanding Reginald Walker, sir. Welcome.
Steve Jones, always a pleasure. Always a pleasure, my friend.
So, and when a team gets into bounce back mode, tell us what that's like. I mean, you had to go through that during your course, your lifetime career, whatever. What are the conversations like in the locker room?
It's frustration. It's a lot of inward reflection, a lot of, the hardest part after a game like that, when you know there's so much on the line, is trying to get past the one or two or three or five, right, depending on who you are, how you look at it, plays that you feel like you may have left on the field, right, where you may have gotten beat. I'm sure there are people jumping on Sean Clifford for the pick to JPT. And look, there was a play on earlier in the week in a college football game. Now I'm drawing a blank of what game I was watching, or maybe it's the Thursday, might have been the Thursday night NFL game. And there was a pick made by a defensive lineman, and I remember being around several people, and we all went, "You can say whatever you want. That's just a freak play. That the defensive player made a great play." Same thing. Now Sean's probably looking at that play 1,000 ways to Sunday, trying to figure out how he threw that pick. At the end of the day, sometimes the other guy just makes a play.
When you look, how quickly can players, for the most part, process and then go to the next one? I get it's all on an individual basis, but for the most part, as a team, how quickly can they process, and what does routine mean to going to the next one?
I think that's the most important part. You have to get back to your routine. You can't. One of the things that, and I've talked to a lot of coaches about this over the years. Unfortunately, at times I've been around some programs as an analyst that have lost some games in a row, had some losing streaks. And one of the things I talk a lot to them about is, what do you change in the process? And the first thing they say, and I say it that way purposely. And Steve, I think you know exactly where I'm going here.
Yep.
The first thing they say is you can't change your process.
That's right.
If you start to change, you've got 18 to 22-year-old kids that are going to start to question if it was a good plan to begin with. And when that starts to happen, you can lose a football team really, really fast. So sometimes, I know it sounds crazy to some people, but you have to continue the process the same way you always do, whether that's as a football player or as a loan officer or as a realtor. Like, all of those things are the same. You still have the same process. That's how you get better. That's how you work things out.
And I know we talked about this 2 weeks ago, but I'll bring it up again. The worst thing anybody can do, especially when you're in management or leadership, you don't panic. Okay? You know what you have and why you have it. So, that's why you go back to work. And, you may have to make corrections, but corrections is different than changing the process.
That's exactly right. And the corrections may be anything from, if we're having some issues running the football, maybe we're going to be more of a zone-based running team versus a G scheme, right? Or something like that. Or if you're going to make changes, maybe you work with a quarterback, in that situation on, whatever his read key might be, right? Yeah. But you don't just radically go and say, we're going to throw this offensive playbook out, or we're going to throw this defensive scheme out and come up with a completely new one. That'll get you in trouble. But you do make tweaks, absolutely.
Sure.
And maybe you change how you coach some things, okay? If we're running this route concept against this defense, well, everybody's kind of figured out we prefer to go to the number 2 read here because that's what's been open. Now they're taking that away. Let's look at that number 3 read and make that sort of the primary read now moving forward.
Penn State has played in atmospheres of a blackout at Purdue, an orange out at Auburn, a maize out at Michigan. And then with all due respect, there's this one. When Penn State went to Indiana and you were part of the football team, what did it take for everybody to, quote, generate their own juice?
I don't know if we ever got it, right? And the funny thing about that, Steve, like the mindset for us was we had to treat it like Northwestern.
Yeah.
You have to treat it as if there's, obviously no one there in some of those situations. And what you mainly do there is you have to make sure you start fast.
Yeah.
Because the juice will come with the fast start. So you almost want to, and everybody talks about this, how you manage emotion early and control the adrenaline and all this. No. In a game like this, you need the adrenaline early to get you through the first quarter because there's no atmosphere to pull you. And so you can allow your adrenaline, you can allow your energy to be elevated, if you will, early on because you don't have anything else to draw it from. So if it's already up high, then it kind of helps you out.
Well, I have to ask you about the situation down there because you've got an NFL team and a college team both in search of coaches at this point. So we'll start with the college team first because I know this one's a little more personal for you, obviously. Because how tough was that to see that happen?
It was hard. It was really hard because there were so many factors in it, right? Obviously, the wins and losses were an issue and a factor, but there was a lot of injuries that were a part of that factor with this football team. You had a lot of new players that were a part of those factors. And then in some ways, you had, obviously closer to the end, you had a fan base that was reacting a certain way. And you saw a guy in Will Healy who I did indeed, incidentally, had a chance to talk to earlier this week, and his spirits are pretty high. But he was a guy that was just, and it was interesting listening to him in news conferences because a lot of the time he would get this question, right? Coach, what seems to be the reason why you're not able to get over the hump? And I was waiting for the day, Steve, where he flat out said, if I knew, I wouldn't be sitting here answering this question.
All right.
And he never went there.
All right.
And that's what tells me what type of person we're dealing with. Let's take away the football coach for a second. That tells me what type of person you're dealing with when they never get frustrated by the question and they never let their answers become an attack on the person asking the question, even though that was the simplest and most realistic answer. If he knew the answer to that issue, that team wouldn't have been 1-7 this year under his leadership. So that made it very, very difficult. But I think the other part of it, and this is the part that I don't think a lot of people on the outside are understanding. As you know, Charlotte is in Conference USA right now, but they're going to the American next year.
Right.
Momentum going into a new conference, and let's just face facts. The level of players, the talent level that you're going to consistently face in the American is higher than that of Conference USA.
Agreed.
So from that standpoint, the administration was also trying to look at what their momentum and what the trajectory looked like going into the new conference. Now, here's the thing that they're going to have to figure out. I read a piece right after the firing happened late last week, early this week, somewhere in that range. The average, or what Charlotte spent from a coaching standpoint this year, not to put too many people's dollars and cents out there publicly, was about $2.5 million for their staff, that coaching pool.
Yeah.
Well, the average in the American Conference is about $6.5 million.
Right.
So that is a major change, and I'm very curious to see where that money comes from with Charlotte. And I've done some digging and asked some questions, but I don't know that there is a check writer at Charlotte like there is in the American at places like Memphis, who has Fred Smith from FedEx, places like SMU, who have some of those folks with oil money down in Texas. I'm not sure where that kind of money is going to come from at Charlotte. So I'll be very interested to see what it looks like next. Because
Charlotte's not going to win a lot of recruiting battles in that area. There's a lot of talent down there, but Clemson's close, Georgia's close, North Carolina, NC State, Wake Forest. I mean, and not only that, you've got Penn State, Ohio State, Michigan. They're all creeping into that area if there's a player worth their salt down there. So it must be a tough recruiting landscape.
It is. I'm glad you brought that up. I'll tell you a little bit of an added piece to that. You mentioned, some different programs, including Georgia. The interesting thing about that is when Kirby Smart left Alabama, went to the University of Georgia, I talked to some people around Alabama, and one of the things I was able to ascertain in some of those conversations, Nick Saban was going to not stop, but kind of pull back a little bit in terms of the range in recruiting in the state of Georgia because he knew battling Kirby Smart for those kids was going to be very, very difficult. and he was going to shift more of his focus to the Charlotte area,
right?
Because he knew that there was more and more talent here, and it was increasing and improving. And so that gives you an example. And I'll tell you another thing he did that made it even more blatantly obvious. A guy that was at Charlotte just recently as an assistant coach, Joe Cox, who played high school at Independence High School, was part of that winning streak. Like, they didn't lose a game for like 7 years.
Right.
Him and Chris Leak, starting quarterback, and Joe Cox and DJ McFadden Jr. And all these different guys that won a whole bunch of games. Joe was on the staff at Charlotte. He now is on the staff at Alabama. Yeah. And I can tell you right now, I've seen him a couple of times in the airport here in Charlotte with Alabama gear on. Incidentally, I believe it was to recruit kids in this area. So that tells you the focus on this area. If Alabama's coming all the way in here and at times bypassing Georgia, bypassing parts of South Carolina to get here, that tells you where the talent level is.
Then there's state colleges, and Penn State's Matt Rule, obviously out, getting paid by David Tepper and Carolina. Steve Wilkes done a good job with them to this point, but how does that coaching start? What do you think? What direction might that go in with the NFL team?
Well, I think that's the most interesting thing to see. I know I can tell you this. I've been around David Tepper. In the conversations I've had with him in the same room, same space, he seems very, very calculated and timid. But from what I understand, sometimes behind closed doors with people more involved in his business dealings, he's a lot more impulsive. And so my concern and question, I shouldn't say concern, my more of question is, where is he going to go in terms of a coaching search? Is he looking for a big name that has done it at a high level in the NFL, i.e. a guy like Sean Payton, who is not coaching right now? They would still have to get through some contractual things to get him out of the New Orleans Saints. I'd be surprised if an interdivision team allows that. Does he go after a guy like an Eric Bieniemy and give him an opportunity? Or does he go with some guys that maybe don't have as big a names but could be proven commodities? Steve Wilkes is certainly, as the interim right now, is certainly gaining a lot of positive momentum because of the way this team looks and how much better they are playing. Or does he look in other places to find a coach that is an up-and-comer and give them an opportunity that may not be as big a name? I think that's what's going to be interesting to watch. I think David Tepper is going to probably lean towards trying to find a big name so he can invigorate some juice into the franchise. But I think Steve Wilkes, if all of a sudden they win 3 or 4 or 5 games down the stretch here, all of a sudden I think that may change. But keep your eye on somebody like a Sean Payton or somebody of that ilk with that NFL pedigree.
My friend, always a pleasure. Thanks so much. Appreciate you.
Anytime, Steve. Anytime. You know that. For you guys, I will always make my calendar open.
Appreciate it. Thanks so much, Reginald.